So I have been given the topic of asking hard questions and having hard conversations. So just to start off, if you're Canadian, can you put your hand up, please? Yeah, so this one's going to be a bit rough for you. We're very hard people. It's so hard to have hard conversations, but we're going to do our best. Now, Claudia, can you put your hand up for me? It's Claudia. Claudia's Italian. She's not going to have a very difficult time with this session. But there were a couple of things that were related to this that I wanted to just touch on that we've heard today. So just to remind everybody, from our very fearless leader, Maureen, so this is hard work. That was a quote we heard today. From Amanda, she said, learn to be comfortable with having tough conversations. So this is what we're here for. We talked a little bit about the point of COSA today, and COSA is a circle, which means collectively you are providing something to that core member. And we need to be good at providing what the core member needs. And sometimes what they need is to be asked hard questions and to be challenged. So I really want us to take the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, and I'm going to talk about 3 types of hard questions or hard conversations that we go through at COSA. And for all of them, you'll turn around and have a chance to talk to your group. Really share experiences you've had with your circle specifically, because the intent of advanced training is that everybody here has had very different experiences at their circles. Some of you have experienced something that no one else has ever experienced before. So I really encourage you to share times where you had hard conversations so we can all try to benefit from that experience. So the 3 types of hard conversations I'm going to talk to you about. So one is asking hard questions, one is asking challenging questions, and one is about trying to provide critique or feedback. Those are the 3 things we're going to focus on today. So to start off, we'll talk about hard questions. And this relates a lot to the conversation we had this morning. There are a lot of people who come from a faith-based background who might have a hard time asking certain questions, but also, and we were talking about this at lunch, there are questions you're going to ask in COSA that you're not going to ask your coworkers or family members. So, and if somebody were to drop themselves in, kind of parachute into your meeting and hear the kinds of questions you were asking, it would sound a bit strange. But in that room, we are a circle, and we're trying to provide important feedback and important sort of constructive direction to our core member. And to be able to do that, we have to ask hard questions. So I'm going to give you an example of a hard question. Did you masturbate last week? Not a question I've asked my family, friends, or coworkers, but it is a question that I ask every single week when I'm in that COSA circle. What I'd like you to do right now is turn your chairs around and come up with 5 questions that you find you don't ask your friends or family, but you think are important to ask in a COSA circle. And after sort of 5 minutes or so, I'll just ask a person from each group. You don't have to pick someone specifically, but if you've got an example of a good question that you think is important to ask, please stand up and share it with the group. Okay? So we'll just spend 5 minutes just think about questions that you think are important to ask in COSA that you would not ask to your friends or family outside.
Well, we asked about accessing pornography, and then how did you react to that pornography?
Perfect. Really, really good example, asking about pornography. So why would we want to know about their habits relating to pornography? So it's funny, like, what would be the kind of thing you're, as a volunteer, trying to understand?
Where they're accessing it.
So where they're accessing it. So that might be a term of their condition, or just if they're doing it in a library, a public place, rather than at their home. So what else might we be interested about when we start asking about pornography? Is it a trigger? So we're trying to calibrate if in the past they've accessed a lot of pornography, their crime cycle occurred when they were consistently reviewing pornography. So what about the kind of pornography? We might want to know that as well. So we talked a little bit this morning about calibrating our bar for the circle, right? So where we come from for our core member is, are they engaging in consensual sex with somebody? That's what they should be focused on. And if you are asking, hey, well, what kind of pornography do you access? And they say, like, aggressive, dominatrix. You might be, okay, well, hold on, that's a bit aggressive. If you already don't have a full understanding of what a consensual, appropriate sexual relationship is it appropriate for you to be accessing that kind of pornography? So that's some of the reasons why we might want to know about that. Okay, great question, pornography, perfect. This is the part of the YouTube clip as well. It's going to be really weird. Okay.
Besides, talking about pornography, as you mentioned, there was one question that came up in our circle, and that was, what are you thinking about when you're having sex with your spouse? And because that's a dangerous area. Are they thinking about children? Are they thinking about, other than what they're doing,
Yes. So fantasizing as a whole, I think even not when you're engaging in sexual acts, but even just when your core member's fantasizing, what are they fantasizing about? Because one thing, if you're fantasizing about a person you have a loving relationship with, that's not a bad place to be at compared to fantasizing when, your core member flipped through a magazine, there was a picture of a child and they fantasized about that. Really, really important thing to know that was a trigger. And we've had that conversation actually. So we had a core member who we asked, have you had any issues with fantasizing this week? And what was interesting is they paused because they wouldn't have admitted this to their PO because they were worried about how it would sound, but they wanted to tell us because they wanted to know how to not do this in the future. And they said, well, actually, I received a magazine from the Bay. There was a children's section for clothing, and I masturbated to one of the children. And I don't want to do that again because when it was done, I was really, really scared. And so we said, okay, well, let's actually spend the rest of the meeting talking about that. Let's unpack that a little bit more. So what are things you can do to prevent it from getting to that point next time? So it's really, really important to talk about fantasizing as well, 100% agree. Jogging around. Sorry, everybody.
Well, all said, also I could just say there was another aspect. If your core member is having a serious problem with masturbation, it's a significant and constant thing in their life. That gives you an opportunity to dig deeper. You can ask the question, well, what are you fantasizing while you're having sex with yourself? So, it's not just like fantasizing with your spouse or such. It's you're having a virtual sexual relationship with somebody who isn't there, and often it's going down a road that's inappropriate. So we need to go into that and try and discover other kinds of release if there's that much frustration. Found in one case, they were just bored out of their mind. They had no job, no place to go, no money. So they spent their afternoons spending their afternoons. And unfortunately, that always went in the direction of underage children, rather than being stimulated by taking revenge. You mentioned a magazine. Well, the other side of that is, after doing that, they might go out and try and obtain such a magazine to make it more real.
Absolutely, yeah. So along the line of fantasizing, I think that is really important. And so one thing you raised was a really good point. Is are they fantasizing about somebody that they made up? Are they fantasizing about a person they saw at a bus stop today? Are they fantasizing about a person they see regularly but don't have a relationship with? Those would result in 3 different triggers for you to think about what do you want to ask as a follow-up question. So what are their risk factors? What are you concerned about?
In connection to what we said this morning, what are you spending your money on? Because it's something you wouldn't ask them.
It's not all about sex and masturbation. Some of the questions that we want to ask are actually just things you wouldn't feel comfortable with. So yes, thank you for that. It's a really, really good example. And we heard that during the budgeting. Okay, you put a blank line in an item. What? So could you talk a little more about that? So want to know why that's there. Really, really, really good. Oh, yeah, Maureen.
Just one other point too, when you ask them the question about what they are fantasizing or thinking about when they are having sex with their wife or their girlfriend or whatever, sometimes the answer will really shock you. And it's not only once, but at one group I was talking to, and then he says, my wife and I don't have sex. We've never had sex. And all of a sudden, what you thought was a pretty, probably okay, he was having his needs filled, you realize he's probably at a greater risk than someone who hasn't got a relationship. So that question alone tells you a lot and can tell you even more about their sex life just by asking it.
That's a really good point, Maureen. And so the consistent sort of thread here that we all talked about and sort of how this all brings together, the reason we ask hard questions is to calibrate what the circle means. needs and what your core member needs. So if you imagine you had a massive flowchart trying to figure out where your core member falls into, maybe more like a Plinko board where it can sort of bounce down, it can go in any direction. We are using hard questions to know which sort of threads we need to talk about. So if you ask, do you masturbate a lot? And they say, no, actually I don't have a very high sex drive. You can go, okay, maybe that's something that we don't need to explore as much. If they said, yes, I do masturbate, I said, okay, great, what about? And they say, my partner. You say, okay, that's a different thread that I'm going to go down. I masturbate my children, or I am focused on people I meet frequently, but they don't know that I'm thinking about them. All of that gives you very, very different pieces of information to then focus on as a circle. So it's about calibration. That's why we need to be comfortable asking hard questions. Perfect. Everybody nailed that. Way to go. Okay. Challenging. This is a really important one. We need to be able to push back. We talked a little bit about accountability, and the way that we keep our core members accountable is to challenge them on lines of thinking or lines of reasoning that are appropriate. And I'll share with you a story that I experienced through COSA that I still struggle with, to be perfectly honest, but I've had one circle close. And so I've usually, on the 3 circles that I've been a part of, I tend to be the challenger. We talk about roles that you kind of fall into. Mine actually stays remarkably consistent. I tend to be the one that asks somebody to unpack that a little bit more, or to explain what they need, or to justify. And so I had a core member that I repeatedly challenge all the time, and balance it with so compassion and caring. But my goal was, when they said something, wouldn't let them get away with that comment. If they just said, my PO's out to get me, I'd say, hold on, we got to talk about what that means. And so our circle closed because one day I was challenging our core member on something, and they said, you know what, I think this is really unfair. You're being totally unfair to me. That's not an okay thing to say. I'm really angry. I feel like I'm being judged. I'm being hard done by. And he walked away from the circle. Didn't come back. We had a debrief about it, to talk about it. And I really struggled with that, because we challenge our core members because we care. We have to balance it with love, compassion, and consideration. But I had a hard time with that, and I've still had a hard time. But I would say more recently my line of thinking has been along the lines of, well, you know what, if a person couldn't be challenged on thoughts that weren't okay, then we wouldn't be doing our job here as COSA volunteers. So if they are going to say things that are unfair, then we have to challenge them. And that's a potential outcome of it, which isn't good, but it's something that's important. So the reason that we challenge people is to make sure that we are trying to correct behaviors, or to draw attention to behaviors, is a better way to put it, so that our core members can start to think about them a little bit more. And what I would like you to do in your groups right now is 2 things. One is to talk about a time where you challenged your core member. So can you share a story, just a short snippet with the rest of your group about a time that you challenged your core member on something? And then 2, as a group, try to come up with do's and don'ts of ways to challenge. Because we talked about this morning, challenging should be respectful, it should come from a place of care. We had a really, really nice talk from Amanda here just about how you can challenge effectively. So what I'd like you to do as a group is try to come up with a list of do's and don'ts for ways to challenge someone effectively. And at the end of this, we'll come back. This one I'll give you a little more time for. I'll give you 10 minutes. And at the end, if you can pick somebody to share just a sort of the main do and the main don't that you talked about a lot as a group, that would be helpful. So let's just spin your chairs around and talk about that for a little bit, about challenging your core members.
So our do was just to, it's really important to be honest with your core member, but you need to do it in a way that they can receive. So it's kind of about, building that trust with them, making sure that level of trust is there before you really try and push them on things, because otherwise it just might be really not well received and it just might not work. I'm not sure we really came up with a don't.
What don't?
You have to be careful about judging or criticizing. I know we kind of had a bit of conversation, maybe there are times that you can judge a little bit, but just again try to be careful of how much you're just constantly criticizing them.
Really, really good points. So we talked about this before too. I think if your entire, if the whole meeting is you challenging them on everything that they say, they're not going to feel like that's a very good space. So you really need to pick your battles, and it gets back to the calibration we talked about with hard questions. So if they're talking about something that is related to a risk factor, challenge them on it. If they're talking about something that's not related, and maybe it's just, that's not the only way you can think about it, that's probably not the hill you have to die on, so maybe space that out. Or if you've noticed the whole meeting thus far has been about challenging, maybe it's a good time to take a bit of a break, or so for the next meeting, let's focus a little more on what they've done as opposed to challenging them on everything. So it's a balance, which is really important.
I'll do the do.
I don't know what to do with.
What we decided on not doing was don't fill in the blanks for them. If you say, why do you do this? Is it because? Whatever. Well, yeah, sure. You know, you're not challenging them. And I've seen that happen and it's really frustrating because what is the truth? We don't know because you just gave them an answer.
Well, just to say that, having asked a challenging question and then the court member just shuts down, like they just simply shut down. So I think you have to do this to be very intentional about returning to that subject at another time.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Yes, those are great. Who do we have? Yeah. Perfect.
Well, I guess the one that I was gonna share would be a do, and it was thinking about what the core member said and taking it a little bit further, and it was early in our group. He was saying that he didn't think that what he'd done was all that bad and it was artistic and really he was being unfairly targeted for it. And I thought about it for a while, and then I said to him, well, would you have done this if there'd been another adult present? And he admitted after a bit of thought that no, he probably wouldn't have. And I guess that was an example of taking the question a little bit further. So, does anybody have a negative?
Don't? Oh, perfect.
I like the don't filling in the answers.
Don't fill in the answer. That's a good one. Yeah, so ask open-ended questions. Those are good. Don't give them the question and the answer at the same time. But a do and a don't. Enjoy your lead in.
So we were just saying, I forgot what we said. Like, do go and you go back to why you're there and why the CM is there. Go back to, and then from there, what did you say? Let the CM talk, and then based on what he's saying, then the challenging question would come. So, for example, if he keeps on saying, and most of our CMs are smart, intelligent, very articulate, most of them, and sometimes they say, the system isn't working, they're so stupid, the programs are stupid, and I'm smart, and la la la. And a challenging question, that I would say is, if you're so smart, why are you here? Why do they catch you if the system is not working, the programs? And yet they talk about the programs as if the programs help them, and then you would pick up on that and you say, there, you see, the program is working, so how come you were actually practicing what they were, teaching you in the program? So sometimes, like what Karen was saying, you have to listen to what they're saying and hold them accountable to that. So it's what they said, and then you're just gonna use it to challenge them. And the don't is, I think, don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Don't be shy. Don't let the moment pass. If you think you want to tug on that thread a little bit, it's really good to just go through it. So two other do's that I would suggest, things that have worked well in other circles. One is to encourage them to think about it from someone else's point of view. I'm sure we can all put our hand up and say we've heard a core member say, my PO's out to get me, they're not here to help me, they're awful. So challenge them. Say, if you read about you on a piece of paper, what would you think? Because that's all they have to go on. So is there another reason they might be thinking that way? Is there another reason why they might have rejected your request to go to a movie because it's in your conditions? Try to encourage them to think about another sort of point of view when they're doing that. And then the other sort of do is reward them when they try to think about the problem from another point of view. So if you challenge them and they come around, like the example where at the end they said, actually, you know what, I don't think I would have done that in front of another adult. That's a really good moment to say, you know what, I'm really proud of you for thinking about that. that took some time to get to, and I think that's a really positive way you've now seen this. So we need to be able, like, if we're going to challenge, we need to also reward them for trying to take that extra step and not just think about the problem from a superficial level. So the last thing we talked about a little bit, so we're about 10 minutes behind here, I apologize. So I'll just go through this quite quickly. But so one is about critiquing and trying to give feedback. And so this might come up if your core member, it's been a couple of weeks and they're not really actively participating, if they're getting homework and they're not actually doing it. We have very few volunteers in this group, like I was mentioning over there. So if we had 100 core members, ideally we would have 300, 400 volunteers, and we don't. So we need to get the most out of the circle, and that is completely decided upon by the core member. If the core member's not going to show up, then we need to take a hard look at why we are using volunteers for that circle. But rather than just abandoning them, there needs to be an opportunity to provide that feedback, to say to the core member, listen, we've been here for a couple of weeks. You're spending a lot of the time talking about how unfair your PO is, but I don't feel like we're making a lot of progress. So one thing that we also need to get good at, and it can be very hard, is to critique and try to redirect meetings going forward. And so some of that is about challenging them. But at the end of the meeting, if you as a volunteer feel strongly that you're not getting the most out of this, the core member's not putting a lot of effort in, I would really encourage you to try to bring that up at the end of the meeting or perhaps at the beginning of the next meeting. And the tools you can use to do that were mentioned really well by Amanda today. It's to mention it's about compassion, it's about care, and it's about respect. They're not children, and they don't have to be there. So to say, listen, we have a covenant that says you're going to come here each week, you committed to trying to do your homework, you committed to try to manage your anger, as an example, might be one of the items. And to be honest, I really don't feel like we're spending a lot of time talking about that. And I would like to know what the plan is going forward, because we are here to help you, but we will only help you as much as you are prepared to help yourself. So those are good ways to try to redirect the circle. Give it one more chance to boost. You can also, so Maureen is the best at this. So that small little spot on maps at the end where it says, do we want Maureen to come next week? Really, really helpful to have her inject that into the meeting as well. And explain to her, this is why we wanted you to come. We are struggling a little bit to get some traction here. We don't feel like we're making a lot of progress. And then you can have that meeting where you essentially say, look, we either need to redirect here, or we might have to close this circle down. So that's a tough thing to do. And the last piece I'll leave with you is another challenging conversation we don't talk about very much, but a challenging conversation with another volunteer. So one thing, the circle is only as strong as its weakest link. It's only as strong as people who are putting the effort in. And if you have a volunteer who is showing up late, who is not doing their homework, who is not being supportive of the circle, it's actually important for us as volunteers to be able to have that conversation. And to have that conversation as a group, not after the meeting. Don't call them secretly. You can have that conversation at the end. And one good way to have it, because one thing that I think we talk about a lot is the check-in. How effective is our check-in? And some volunteers are spectacularly good at check-ins, and some, you know what, when you're out of practice for a little bit, sometimes you can lose it a little. And there's a form at the end of MAPS as well that gives you an opportunity to ask the core member how they feel about check-ins. But if you feel like some volunteers are not necessarily pulling their own weight or are not necessarily providing enough to the circle, it's worth having that conversation with them, and that can be very, very difficult to do. Yes?
In front of the core members?
So that's I'm going to freewheel this for you, Steve, because honestly, I've only had this conversation one time. So I spoke to the volunteer afterwards, and it was purely focused on the check-in. So in the past, I would share my example of this is when I had a circle where I thought we were not doing as good as we could on check-ins, I spoke to the volunteer afterwards. But one example where you might want to have the conversation as a group is if you thought there's either too much challenging or not enough challenging. So if you have that conversation as a group with the core member there, then at least they can weigh in on how much they feel. I'd agree, I feel I'm being challenged too much. So if I said, hey, it feels like we're maybe doing a little too much challenging as a group, if the core member said, yes, I agree, then it's really good to have them there to provide that feedback. If they said, well, actually, I don't really think so, it's still useful that you had that conversation as a group so they feel a part of that discussion. But the key difference there is you're talking about it as how effective the circle is. So if there's something that you specifically would like to talk to a volunteer about individually, then that would be something that I would suggest you do after.
Yeah, I agree partially. I really think it's very important if something's going on in the circle with a particular volunteer that is brought up in the group in front of the core member. Unless the core member, like we have a couple who have fairly severe brain damage, that might be a little different. But when the guys are bright and with it, they're very aware of what's going on. So we need to also learn to be able to challenge each other in the group. So I would encourage to do it in front of the core member. The other thing, when you mentioned about being there entirely, and it hit me, I get volunteers sending me emails. You know what? It's very frustrating, Maureen. On our circle, they named the volunteer. You know what? They're doodling all the time. It's very frustrating, not just to the core member, but to me. And I have a bad habit of doing that, Or they're looking at their cell phones, and we expect that volunteers not, we expect the core member not to, so why are the volunteers? So, I mean, I think it's very easy to say, really nicely, hey, you know what, I'm bothered, I'm looking at your doodle, instead of looking. And I think that's part of the growing. We need to grow as people too. We don't do everything right. What does that say to the core member? If we can challenge him in front of everyone, but we can't challenge each other. And I think that's why I love husband and wives on circles, because they often kind of challenge or butt heads, and core members will say, is it ever good to see somebody else getting in trouble, right? But I think this is really good, this is healthy. Then they can see, what Anne's is saying and that she doesn't like, or whatever, about Jens. I think this is really good. They're not the only ones who make mistakes, so. And the other thing, when you talked about, at the end of the meeting and kind of, hey, this doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and Linnea pointed this out to me the other day, we're really falling down on keeping up on covenants. If people were re-looking at their covenants every 3-6 months, right, we wouldn't have to have those discussions. Where are we going? What do we need?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so one thing too, if you find that as a volunteer you are receiving feedback from another volunteer, really important to view it as a learning experience, right? Because that's also what we want the core member to feel like. When they are, so if they receive feedback on something that they could be doing better, we want to demonstrate the behavior that we want to see them demonstrate in the future, which is to view a critique not as, well, so I'm being targeted, that's so unfair. It's, okay, that's an opportunity for me to learn. I'm being told that there's a way that I can do this that's better. Let's put a positive spin on that and see if I can practice that next time. Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very, very much. Well, now we're coming towards the close of the session today. Any questions from anybody on any of the subjects? Yes.
Judging and criticizing, those are bad, right?
The what, sorry?
Judging and criticizing.
Yeah.
Is it actually possible to challenge without judging or criticizing?
Is it possible to challenge without being judging or criticizing?
I think it's how you word it. Instead of saying, you know what, you shouldn't get angry like that, you say something to the effect, are you feeling angry? Or it sounded to me like you're getting upset or anything. It's how we word it, I would say. Does that answer your question? Sure. Give me an example, Jens.
English is not my first language, but when I hear judging or criticizing, my understanding is finding fault with the other person.
There's a responsibility that goes with the core member when they join the circle. They do the disclosure, they say, this is what we've done, these are our risk factors, and I'm open to being challenged on them. So that's not a criticism, that's challenging them. They're there because they don't want to go back to prison. So that's a little bit different, I think. Does that help?
It's a tough thing to do, though. It takes practice to learn.
Yeah.
It's not something that you're just inherently good at.
Just to make yourself doing the right thing, not the wrong thing.
Maybe the thing is think of how would, if you were trying to say something very sensitive to your wife or your mother or something, and you're trying to find the best way to word it. You say, how can I say it so that she understands what I mean, at this point. So it's difficult, you know, it's like you gotta have kid gloves on sometimes. There's no doubt.
I'm working on it.
And, okay, yes?
Just one thing I find is helpful is to express your own feeling about something, you know, rather than say, you know, you did something wrong. You know, to say, but when you were talking about this, you know, it made me feel concerned, you know, the red flag went up, you know, and then pass it, you know, give it back to them, and then help them to discover it for themselves.
That's a very good point. And the other thing is, remember, you're one out of a team of volunteers. Other ones might use their gifts to be able to do that instead. So use your other members, your other volunteers to help you until you get, and we're always trying to improve ourselves, always trying to get better at something.
And the covenant, there again, the covenant, they've agreed to certain things. So I don't think it's a criticism if you agreed to this, is this happening?
Any other questions?
This is my question to you all. Would you find it helpful for me to email you all the notes that I've been making?
Yes.